Everyone, and welcome to another snack seminar today with Rob and Alexi, formerly from Imperial and kind of all scattered around Europe at the moment. And they're going to be presenting some of their collaborative work on complex networks. And I first came across their work when I was trying to work out how I would ever apply a whole lot of different complex network measures in some project that I'm doing at the moment. And then somehow 3 or so weeks later, we just came across their preprint as if they could, their ears were burning and they heard us. So I'm very glad for this work they're about to present today. And take it away, Rob.
Cool, thanks. All right, share screen. Hopefully you can see that. Cool, great. So today we're just going to give a kind of an overview of kind of some of the work that me and Alexi have done collaboratively. And that's why we decided to kind of just split the talk. It would be easier given that all of this work is kind of stuff we've been doing together. Most of this work was conceived during our time at Imperial College under Mauricio Barahona. And of course, a lot of it, I mean, all of it is kind of very network related. So I think first, a very short introduction to networks. I know most people here already know a lot about networks, either from the neuroscience perspective or coming from kind of more complex systems type approach, an angle. So I won't be on that for too long. And then a quick background on kind of machine learning and networks, because it will set the foundations for the method that Oliver was describing, which is this highly comparative graph analysis, which I'm sure sounds very similar to highly comparative time series analysis, which was developed by Ben a few years back. And of course, the name and a lot of the approaches were strongly inspired by that. And then the kind of second half of the talk, we decided would be a bit more on the multi-scale structure of networks. And this is something that's quite important across many different network systems. And a lot of the work that me and Alexi have done collaboratively have kind of probed the multi-scale structure of networks. And so we'll kind of give a little bit of an outlook on that. So, what are networks? Well, in the simplest cases, they're nodes that are connected by edges. And it's a very, networks provide a very powerful framework for modeling different systems. So anything from electrical grids, where your nodes might be junctions and your edges might be transmission lines, through to molecules with atoms and the interactions between them, such as bonds. Brain networks, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, of which there's many different types, from kind of functional through to structural connectivities, and social networks, and kind of many more. Really, any system where you have relational data between kind of actors or nodes in a network, you can try and model it using a network. What we won't really touch on at all here is the kind of generalizations of networks. So of course, some of you have probably come across things like hypergraphs and simplicial complexes. And I'm just mentioning those so you know that they exist, and they're a very interesting area of kind of network science, and that they're seeing a lot of research currently. But we're not really going to touch on that. We'll just stick with kind of your kind of bog standard networks. Given that there are so many different systems which you can apply or you can model with networks, there's been, over the past few decades, a lot of research into trying to probe these systems, trying to extract information about the system which you're modeling using graph theoretical algorithms. So it might be trying to identify the influence of nodes. So you can use things like centrality measures. Maybe you're trying to understand flows on a network, and there are kind of flow-based methods or dynamical or diffusion-based methods. You might be trying to understand how modular your system is, such as kind of regions in the brain that are kind of clustered together. So you can use things like community detection. And so there's been, there's a lot of methods out there, a very kind of large corpus of graph theoretical research. And underlying each one is usually some sort of algorithm. For example, modularity is a quality function that allows us to describe how good a partition of our graph might be. But of course, there are other ways that we can define a quality function for how good a partition is. And there are many other forms of quality function, like Markov stability, that allow us to say how good commuters might be. So, I mean, this is really, the reason I'm saying this is mostly to kind of set the foundation for the methodology we're going to introduce shortly. That there's a lot of methods out there, they already exist, and they're very, very good for probing whatever system we're interested in. So before I introduce the methodology, highly comparative time series analysis, let's have a quick look at kind of machine learning on graphs. We can generally break machine learning on graphs into unsupervised and supervised. And this is obviously the case with machine learning kind of in general. And I know there are things in between, like semi-supervised and other things like this, but we'll just separate it into unsupervised and supervised. For those of you who aren't too aware, unsupervised machine learning is when you don't have a ground truth. You're just trying to maybe do something with the data, but you're not necessarily learning given, having some sort of ground truth about your system, which you're learning against. So unsupervised learning could be something just like visualization, but it could also be something like community detection, where you're looking for underlying structure in your network, but you don't necessarily have any information about the ground truth of that structure. It could be that you have data and you want to generate or reconstruct a graph from data that has been produced from a graph. You could do something like link prediction. This kind of sits somewhere between unsupervised and supervised. So maybe you want to identify a link in a social network between two actors and whether that link should exist or not. And you can do that in kind of an unsupervised way using kind of probabilistic methods, but you can also try and learn whether a link should exist based on the attributes that exist on the nodes. So that would take a more supervised approach. So supervised is where we have a ground truth. And so these are very interesting. It might be that we want to do graph classification. So we have lots of graphs and we have the ground truth of each class. For example, a brain network, we might have healthy and diseased. And we want to classify new networks that we haven't seen before based on whether they're healthy and diseased. But equally, we could also do node classification. So we might have the ground truth information about particular nodes in our graph, but we want to be able to predict the class of unknown nodes in our graph. And so there's kind of lots of different ways that you can view machine learning and with graphs. And so it very much depends on your problem, and there are lots of different methods that kind of approach these different problems from different angles. But more generally, and you can kind of think of machine learning on graphs as trying to create some sort of embedding vector from your graph. Sometimes you might also have a feature matrix that describes additional information. It could be features that describe a graph. It could be features that describe nodes on your graph. But then you also have your graph itself, your network. And you're really trying to learn some sort of embedding vector, or you're trying to create some sort of vector that describes your graph such that you can then use that in some sort of machine learning type algorithm. So on the right here is this kind of framework that was kind of proposed last year, breaking down the kind of different types of graph embedding techniques, like how can we take a graph and how can we embed it. again, of course, you can split it into unsupervised and supervised techniques. You can also then further split them, whether they have here X is like a node or like features that describe your graph. So these might be features of nodes. So we can split it down further. But fundamentally, you come down and there are lots of different methodologies for creating these embeddings of graphs. Some of them are using graph neural networks. So these tend to use things like message passing techniques, where you share information between nodes, and you can learn that within a kind of deep learning architecture. Autoencoders, so you're just learning the graph structure against itself, and trying to learn some kind of latent space in the middle, and kind of many more things based on matrix factorization, kind of Laplacian-based methods, skipgram-based methods, which are kind of developed for things like natural language processing. But basically, the kind of idea of showing this is there's lots of different ways of creating these vector embeddings of our graphs. And just to kind of give you guys a quick background as well, which is not too important, but you can kind of break these different types of kind of machine learning on graphs into kind of two different types of learning. There's transductive learning and inductive learning. So transductive learning is when you cannot generalize to new samples. What do I mean by this? So if I'm doing node classification and I'm trying to classify nodes in my graph, I have the whole graph structure, and I have the ground truth for some of the nodes, but I don't have it for others. The embedding space that I'm going to learn that allows me to predict accurately the class of other nodes within my graph, this is not generalizable to a whole new graph. So the model that I've learned is only applicable to the graph that I have. And so that, in this case, it's transductive. Inductive would be maybe if I'm doing graph classification, I learn some embedding space for each of my graphs, and I'm trying to predict for a new graph. And so in this case, it would generalize to unseen samples. And so you can kind of split these kind of machine learning graphs into this inductive and transductive. So a lot of these methods are kind of very, for kind of machine learning graphs, a very deep learning approach. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And generally what we found is that a lot of them make very strong assumptions about how to create these embedding vectors. So for example, a message passing technique for graph, for node classification, which have been very powerful and have seen a lot of attention over the past like 4 or 5 years. These methods make strong assumptions about the homophilic nature of the classes to your graph. So what I mean by this is that they make the assumption that neighbors in your graph should be classified into the same class, or are likely to be similar to each other and therefore should be similarly classified. And these assumptions aren't necessarily correct. And so we kind of took a step back and we thought, well, given that there is so much literature already on graph theoretical methods, can we not just, take a more feature engineering approach, or just kind of like a massive feature extraction approach, where we just use the existing corpus of graph theoretic measures, and we can use that to extract information about our graphs and use that in machine learning algorithms instead. So that's what we did. And so, we take the kind of large corpus of graph theoretical research that I kind of mentioned earlier. And now we try and condense those down into kind of summary descriptors. So we might have something, we might compute something about communities. And then we can turn that into a summary descriptor about saying, how many communities are there? We might compute the between centrality, and then we can turn that into a summary descriptor by saying, what is the average between centrality, or what is the, the standard deviation of the between centrality, or how many cliques are there? And so these are all single value measures that provide a description of your graph. So here we're very focused on graph classification. So we're going to kind of completely ignore the rest of the machine learning on graphs. And so we're trying to create semi-descriptors of whole graphs. Equally, though, you could take an approach, and we haven't done here, which is trying to create semi-descriptors of nodes. And I'm sure there's lots of interest in that kind of direction too. There are many properties I can use.
Rob, can I ask real quick?
Yeah.
Did you make any distinction between measures that were calculated at the node level or versus the edge level? Like you can have edge between a centrality or nodal between a centrality, or were you thinking more along the lines of just sort of broad categories of kind of descriptors of topological structure?
We didn't make any distinction. We basically just tried to compute everything we could possibly calculate,
Nice.
and then compute some sort of, and then summarize that into single values. So it could be
cool.
Edge between us, and then take the average of that, for example.
Got it. Cool. Thanks.
There are many properties, and the question comes, which should I use for a particular problem? This then led to us to kind of develop highly comparative graph analysis. And so this technique, I mentioned earlier, was took a lot of inspiration from hctsa, which is a method I'd actually used previously to kind of analyze some time series data, and it kind of worked very well. And so this had then led us to think, well, maybe we can do the same thing for graph analysis. So it kind of follows a very simple approach. We have kind of a computational pipeline. It's all in Python, and everyone can download it if they wish. But it's very simple. You give it a graph. It computes thousands of these different features, and the number of features will be different if you also have node features as well, or edge features. Those can be incorporated into your network structure, and we can use those to also compute kind of combinations of attributes with the graph. But I won't go into too much of the detail there. But fundamentally, what you can do is you create a vector which describes your graph. And if you do this for many graphs, you end up with some sort of feature matrix, where you may or may not have some sort of ground truth class label, or maybe some sort of continuous variable if you were interested in doing some sort of regression. And then given you have now just a feature matrix, it's very easy to kind of, within the package, to kind of do classification, regression, unsupervised learning if you don't actually have ground truth and you want to just learn the structure of your data. And these are kind of just standard statistical learning methods. I think as default, we've used the XGBoost algorithm for classification. Similarly, for regression, and then for clustering, I don't actually remember which method we have as default here, but I should have checked that beforehand. And the reason for using tree-based algorithms here is because this methodology of feature extraction, not only did we think, okay, can we just leverage the large corpus of theoretical research that already exists for graph theory? Half of this was so we could extract some sort of interpretation of our classifications. If you use a deep learning method, it's very hard to get an interpretation of why you've made a particular classification. There are like graph neural network explainers, but they're still, even with those, they're still quite black box, and it's very difficult to fully explain why you've made a particular prediction. So, knowing what your features mean in terms of, why they've been developed and what the algorithm is exactly computing, we can then get some interpretation. So to get that interpretation, we need to do things like rank features based on their influence over the model predictions. So here we use SHAP analysis, which is a nice way of defining feature importance in tree-based algorithms, but it's also applicable to other forms of machine learning algorithms. And from this, we can identify which nodes were most influential in our model predictions. And this allows us to then understand a little bit more about our system and whether we can condense and differentiate between maybe two classes just based on one or two features. And that then helps us understand, and we can interpret what that actually means in respect to whatever system we're looking at. If it's the brain network, and maybe something like the rich club is useful, and we can understand what that means. So just for clarity, I mean, how does it compare with existing methods? So we, the first thing when you're developing some sort of method, particularly if it's kind of rivaling deep learning methodologies, is that you kind of have to apply it to all the benchmark data sets that currently exist. So we did this, and I think in almost every case, apart from one, we beat all the existing algorithms that were already available. And so there's a lot of biochemical network data sets. I won't go over these, then not hugely interesting, but just act as benchmarks. Equally on social networks, we find that again, we generally beat the existing methods. So these methods are the state-of-the-art kind of deep learning methods, or at least they were when we published about a year or a year and a half ago. Oh, sorry, about when we first submitted about a year ago. So it's good to know that just a standard feature extraction method can already do very well compared to the deep learning methods. That's not to say it always will. I'm sure architectures will come out which will do better from a deep learning perspective. And what we can say is that really this acts as a kind of a baseline for how well methodologies should do. If you can do it just based on feature extraction this well, then if you want to create a new method, you should kind of benchmark against something that was really just based on kind of feature engineering. Can we use it for different systems? And I know this seminar is more neuroscience oriented, but a lot of the examples here are going to be not neuroscience based. But here we were looking at predicting molecular properties. So we worked with some chemists at Imperial College that have been developing like a data set on helicene electronic coupling. And we're trying to understand whether there was, whether we could predict or what features were important for predicting accurately the J coupling in helicene pairs. And we found that very simple things like a larger rich club, lower modularity, lower variation edge betweenness were very good for predicting these kind of electronic coupling values. And so you can kind of see on the right, this was more of a regression problem. But these features are quite good at predicting these physical properties. And I don't want to go into the details of why this might be the case. We tried to provide some interpretation of this, but it's good to see that it works on molecular properties and it works in a kind of regression-based format. This is a little bit more neuroscience focused. Can we differentiate between neuronal morphologies? So this was a data set that Alexis got from the Blue Brain project, I believe. And in this case, we were trying to differentiate between different cell types. Or in this case, I think it was different M types, sorry. And so, we can just, I think we also had node attributes here based on the type of node. I think Alexis will know this a little bit better than I do.
Yes, you're right. Yes.
Yeah. But essentially what we were interested in here was not just differentiating between different M types, but also trying to understand which M types were more similar. So I'm just going to move that out of the way. We could define, based on classification between different pairs of M types, we could understand if we had a low classification accuracy, then we could say that there was a low distance, there was a large similarity between those M types. And from that, we could then do this for every pair of M types, and we can then cluster on this, this distance space. And we could say, okay, which M types are similar to each other, and could we recover the kind of standard cell types that these M types fall into? And what we found is through kind of like a hierarchical clustering, we could find that actually, yes, we could identify these kind of pyramidal cells, Martinotti cells, and other interneurons.
Just the interesting bit is that we didn't use apical dendrites, only basals. And so we see we can differentiate certain M types by only their basals, which are known to be fairly similar across M types. So it's interesting.
Could explain why the layer 2, 3s are sitting up with the thick tufted layer 5 pyramidal cells as well, right? Because they normally look a little different.
Yeah,
so
no, I
cool.
think they're not quite the same. If you look at the matrix, we just put like a box saying other pyramidal.
Oh, yes, I see it. Yeah. They're different than the rest of the clusters, but not that similar to one another. Yeah.
The clustering is a bit, you have to look in details, right? But the interesting part was Martinotti cells were quite nicely correlated, and then you see some little box of 2 by 2 where the layer doesn't matter much, basically. Some yeah. But you can see some structure which corresponds to what we expect from biology, basically.
Cool. So that was kind of interesting. We looked at how networks differ across scientific domains, and kind of extracting. This was from a graph data set that was published maybe a couple of years back or so, and whether we could differentiate between the graphs from different scientific domains. So we have things like active collaborations, crimes, biogeography, ecological interactions, and we were trying to understand here that here we've just taken the feature space, and we've tried to we've just taken, I think this is a PCA. Just trying to visualize where these communities exist, and we can see these kind of very clear clusters of these different scientific domains. And if you can kind of very clearly visualize them, you can probably very easily differentiate them within a machine learning algorithm. And again, we can just kind of identify features that are interesting and useful for differentiating these different network types. Not too interesting. Again, ecological networks, just showing that it works on kind of directed networks as well. So you can extract information from directed networks and you can differentiate between them. And you can tell the difference between an agonistic and mutualistic graph, mutualistic ecological networks, and even tell the difference between different types of ecological networks. So ones that are kind of pollination, seed dispersal, food webs, and so on and so forth. So I won't go too much more into the interpretation of that. What I will do now is kind of jump on to the kind of second half of the talk, which is on the multi-scale structure of networks. And I'll hand over to Alexis in a second. But I think just to kind of point out the importance of this, the multi-scale structure of networks is a very interesting topic. I know you had Olaf Sporns here and give a talk maybe a few months back or so. And so on the right, the brain networks seem to exhibit kind of multiple scales, everything from kind of interactomes, from kind of neurons all the way up to kind of social networks of humans, and kind of everything in between. And so that you can think of, the multi-scale structure of a system is very interesting and important. Equally, you can look at this in protein structures where you have very small structures like chemical interactions through to amino acids, secondary structures in folded proteins, and then kind of domain structures. And equally in social networks, you have interactions that occur at different timescales, from micro, hourly into the daily. And so multiscale structure is very interesting, and being able to probe the multiscale structure of networks, this is also quite interesting. And diffusion, we think is a very good way of probing multiscale structure of networks. And this is an example taken from Mauricio Barrajona's paper back in 2010, which was from Markov stability, which was using diffusion-based processes to uncover the modular structure in networks. So diffusion will get trapped within kind of local regions, and we can identify kind of multiscale modular structure based on using the time scale of diffusion as a zooming lens to scan across scales. And whilst this doesn't form the main part, what we're going to look at, the idea of diffusion and how we can use it as a kind of zooming lens is what's going to kind of form the next part of the talk. So I'll let Alexis jump in now and introduce some of these methods.
Hello, yeah. Thanks, Rob. Nice. So Rob is a very nice collaborator. He gave me 50 slides last night and leaves me 10 minutes to go through them. No, we have until 9 my time, but 5, I guess. Okay, so let's do a bit of mathematics. So as Rob said, the interesting bits we can do on graphs is using diffusion to try to infer the structure of the graph. So this is just a quick recap on what diffusion looks like. So the first line is diffusion on Euclidean space. Then if you just assume that there is a constant diffusion rate, sigma, you can just have a Laplacian, a delta squared. And you can find the solution of this using the Green's function. So just exponential of like a Gaussian kernel, right? And then you can convolve this with any initial conditions that you want and get any solution of the Euclidean space. Now, if you, the interesting thing that we discovered was, noticed was, if you look at what happens, so it's very basic, right? You just take a delta Dirac function and time 0, let it diffuse, and you see the Green's function diffuses, right? So the width increases with time. Now, if you look at what happens at location at 0, where you put the delta function and you look at the amplitude of the mass that diffuses, you see it's just exponential decay. And people have looked at this, and then the rate at which it diffuses gives you an idea of the dimension of your space. Because if you're in 2D, you diffuse faster, so you have a faster rate of decay. Now, if you look at a point that is away from 0, what you see is at 0, there's no mass, and at time infinity, there is no mass, but in between, you increase, and then you decrease. And so you have this kind of a transient peak that appears. And the interesting thing here is, depending on where you are from the 0, the peak time and the peak amplitude varies, and you expect the peak to be later if you are away from 0 and smaller, right? Now this is in infinite dimensional space, so the red line or the plane and so on. Now if you put boundaries, if you confine your diffusion to be in an interval, what you see is you don't go to 0 at infinity, you go to a fixed value, which depends on the length of your interval. And so if you look at the same as before, if you look at a point near 0, you see an increase and decrease. But now if you look at the point away from 0, but close to the boundary, you don't see any peak. Because basically you are too close to the boundary, and there's too much of reflection from the boundary, so you lose track of how far you are from the source, basically. And so we try to use this idea of detecting the peaks or not to infer structure about the graph. And so if we now move from Euclidean space to graph, we just replace the Laplacian by the graph Laplacian L, and P becomes a node vector. So it's just a bunch of values on each node, which increases or decreases. And then we can solve it instead of the Green's function as we showed before, we can solve it as the exponential of the matrix L. So numerically, we can do this for small enough graphs, big enough computers. And so it looks like, okay, so it looks like basically if you start from a node, just one on a node, and you let it diffuse, you see that it's going as the bounded interval type of structure, right? But now it's much more complex, so we don't know where the boundary is, and we don't know where the center, and so on. So we can still use these ideas to infer where the boundary, like the network boundary, would be in terms of if we have a peak or not from a source. So basically, we have a way to assess the which one is, yes, we have a way to assess the role of nodes given the source node, and depending on the amplitude of the peak and the time of the peak. So that's just an illustration. Yeah, if you move on, yeah. So then the idea was, as I said before, is if we have the peak time that is longer, we expect to be further away from the source node. But then we also expect this to be kind of a distance function, right? It gives you the distance from the source node. But we notice that actually it's not a distance function because it doesn't satisfy the triangle inequality always. And so we decided to make a measure out of it. So basically, you try to see how away from the triangle inequality, away from a distance function you are. So basically, you compute this delta thing, which is given 3 nodes, you compute if the triangle inequality is satisfied or not. And this gives us a measure of centrality. So the more you break triangle inequality, the more central you would be in your graph, basically. And we also put, I can go back just a second. We also put, as Rob mentioned, we put a notion of scale. So basically, if the peak time happens before a scale tau, we consider as a peak. And if it happens later, we consider as no peak. And so tau infinity corresponds to only nodes which have a peak, because some nodes won't have a peak because they are too far away from the source, as we saw in the Euclidean space. So this tau gives us a notion of how far away we are allowed to look at to compute the triangle inequality condition. So this is just from the papers, just a summary of how we do it. So this is a Ecological example on the left. We take a source node, Mr. He, in blue. We just let it evolve, and we see a few traces, like there's a green and the orange node. We see the p-value, so one has a peak and one has no peak. And then we compute the peak times in the matrix in the middle. So we see basically like already the structure of the graph, right? We see like two main blocks, which are centered around the two main hubs of the graph. And then we can say, from that we can compute the triangle inequality equations from all of this and assign a value on each node as a function of tau of the time. And we see at short time, basically we are correlated to kind of degree centrality because we see the two hubs. But as time increases, we see that the nodes in between the hubs actually the most central, because they're the ones which are breaking most triangle inequality at a larger scale, so between nodes in each cluster, basically. And so it gives us a way to scan the graph. And so interesting bit is we find that the most central node is one of the nodes which was misclassified, I think, or we find interesting nodes which were the ones really in between the two hubs in the Karate Club. Yeah, so then basically this is we have one measure that kind of spans all the scales, and we see that we'll see just shortly after that it kind of correlates with different classic centrality measures, so we can even provide a notion of scale for each centrality measure. So if we look at again at on the left at the Karate Club, if we trace some of the nodes, we see that they are large at low tau and small at large tau and so on. And if we do the Pearson correlation with different types of centrality measures, we see that some of them correlate more or less with time. And so we can see, for example, betweenness is good at low and degree as well, the closeness for large. And then on the right, we see the same for the dolphin, right? It's a dolphin, like social network of dolphins. And we see similar behavior, and we see different types of correlations, but none of them correlate so well. So maybe for dolphin at low time, we have the grid that correlates well, but so it's still quite different from all of these measures. So it's not very trivial somehow. This one, yeah, then this one we can also do. So we can also do directed diffusion. So we can define the same measure with directed graphs. For example, the C. elegans neuronal network. And we see, depending on the direction of the flow, direction of the edges we use, or even undirected, we get different types of central nodes. So the one that receive most information and the one that send most information. So the one that is more central in the symmetric sense. So that's the different types of neurons, if you know this network. So that was using just the time of the peak. And we have a previous paper where we actually started from looking at the amplitude of the peak, which was used to reclassify, to improve classification of nodes. So basically, we would start from initial conditions, which was already like a probability of being classified or classifying nodes in different class. So there are graph like there are the data set where each node has a class, and you want to predict the class of other nodes which you don't know, but you can use the graph data to actually infer which one are close to the known class graph. And so if you use different initial conditions for each different class, you can use the peak amplitude and see if there is a peak on my node that is larger than the actual class I'm classified into. I can reclassify it in this new class. And we show that this improves almost always the quality of graph classification, of node classification. Sorry. And so it's basically saying that if you look at the diffusion, if you have many nodes of another class nearby you, and the structure of the graph allows it, you have a peak, and therefore you should be classified in this class, not in the other class. So basically, this goes after something like GCN, like the deep learning algorithm, for example, or any basic algorithm you can use. So we played with this idea, and it was quite interesting. Do you have no? There's a table with like we show that it increases by 3% the accuracy. And then there's a third work, which is the latest one, which combines both time and peak amplitude. And so this one was interesting. So we go back to the diffusion equation. So we have the Green's function, and we see the Green's function depends on d, the dimension of the Euclidean space, right? As I said, like if depending on the dimension, you diffuse faster or not, right? Then you can say, okay, well, from this equation in continuous time, Euclidean space, sorry, I can compute explicitly, if I have no boundary, I can compute explicitly the time of the peak and the amplitude of the peak. So t hat and p hat from this equation. It's just basic math. But then those two things depend on d dimension, right? So I can just say if I recall t hat and p hat for any kind of diffusion initial conditions, I can invert those equations and get the notion of d dimension given the source delta function at x0 and the location x, right? So this gives us a notion of dimension between 2 points. And this is exactly equal to Euclidean dimension. If I'm 2D, I just have d equal 2 for all points. Now, if I have boundaries, I will have a d that is lower than 2 if I am 2D because of the boundary effect. So effectively, my space is smaller than 2D if you want. And so we use this idea to use this formula d as a relative dimension to compute dimension between two nodes. So we would just take a delta function on node, run diffusion, look at all the peaks, and then compute this d between any two pairs, which we can then average to get a notion of local dimension on the source node, basically. And so it's kind of trying to see how the diffusion looks. I would say it's trying to infer the dimension at which the diffusion would behave in Euclidean space, but you are on the graph. And so it gives you an idea of Euclidean dimension somehow, but it's fractal in the sense that it's not an integer; it would be a continuous number, right, from this equation.
Alexis, does this work on weighted graphs as well, or is it really
yes,
a binary?
So this works on any kind of diffusion. So if you have a diffusion operator, L, whatever you want, then you can compute the diffusion on the graph and then have these curves and peaks and detect the peak times. So it's really just diffusing with whatever dynamics you want. You can be like diffusion on another thing and then just detecting the peaks. So you need to have, we just tried with classic diffusion, but you need to have a meaningful diffusion where you can detect peaks and compute the solution, right? That's the, yeah. So basically this is how it looks like. This one is just the interval. So this is back to Euclidean somehow. So we discretize the line, the interval with nodes. So we have a line graph and we can compute for each node the diffusion trajectories, which are in gray, the light grays. And we see there are a lot of peaks. And if we detect the red dots are basically the location of the peaks in peak and time in log scale. And we see there is a nice fit that goes through d equals 1 because it's just a line, 1d. But then we see there are boundary effects. So the blue thing on the bottom is where you have boundary effects. And we see that most of on the B panel on the bottom, you have the actual dimension we compute from the source. So you see at the source, there is a kind of a kink. And then near the boundary, we decrease dimension. So we fill the boundary more. So we are effectively less than 1D. And then there is a region which is unreachable, meaning that there is no peak. So we don't even know which dimension we are in. We're like too far away from the source and too close to the boundary to have any information from the diffusion, right? And if we look at 2D, we can see the same effect. So the D panel on the bottom is just the local dimension on so the average at each node of the local relative dimensions. So we see near the center we don't see the boundary, so we are more 2D, and near the boundaries we reduce dimension. and the top panel I forgot, so it's not, yeah. And then if we increase the size of, basically if we increase the size of these grids or lines, we expect to tend to the actual dimension of the space. And this is what we see. So if we increase the bottom panel, we see if we increase number of nodes, we tend towards 1 or 2 dimensions. But of course, if we have 2D or 3D grid, the boundary is much bigger in terms of volume, and therefore it's you need a lot of nodes to actually converge. Yeah. So then, okay, now we have a bunch of examples. So this one was some work we're doing in London also on proteins. So basically, from protein, you can you know the location of each node, each atom, and you know the type of bonds we have between atoms. And so you can build a graph where the weights are the energy of the bonds. And then you can ask the question of allostery. So you have small molecules which attach to the protein and have an effect, non-trivial effect on the another part of the graph. And we know where there are those 2 parts, and we want to see if the relative dimension of one to the other is significantly different from the average dimension of the protein. And we see very nice correlations between the structure of the protein and what we know from biology, from chemistry. So this, if you want, in the paper, we explain a bit more in details different proteins, what they are doing, and so on. And then we also see that this dimension correlates nicely with this RMSF, which is like the flexibility of the protein, or the rigidity of the protein, which we can measure from some, I forgot how it's done, but there's some computation for this.
So, so this was using like molecular dynamics simulation to get the RMSF.
So really physical principles of the protein, and our measure is just like the structural shape of the protein, and so there's nice correlation. And also you can find different types of regions of the protein which are more or less flexible. At the bottom, you see that there are like 2 states of one protein which open or close, and we see that the 2 regions which connect, which open or close, are quite different in dimensions. So that was Rob's PhD, right? This figure, this protein. Let's see how much. Yeah, okay. So this is another example. We tried to. So as you are saying, that different types of diffusion, we also have like SIR dynamics we can define on the graph. And so we were asking the question: can we use this notion using just diffusion? Because diffusion somehow is a linearization of SIR dynamics, if you know epidemics. And so this is a nonlinear system where you can solve, and you want to see if we could sort of predict the outcome of the nonlinear system using this measure. And so we found this nice correlation between. So this is okay. On the left, you see the scale tau on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you see the infectability of the division process. So it's a parameter in the dynamics. And we run this for small world graphs, which are basically put nodes on the circle and you wire randomly across. And this has a nice property that and then we do the Pearson correlation between the local dimension and the actual fraction of infected nodes. And so we see that there's a nice correlation between the scale of diffusion that we use and the infectability. So for small infectability, we only infect local region of the graph. And so we only need information about local regions to actually predict it well. But that's when we go to critical infectability, we need basically a much larger probing of the graph to actually predict the infectability of one node. And so this happens only in like grid-like or small world graphs. Otherwise, it's more difficult to actually see this relationship. So somehow you need a kind of grid-like structure locally, and not too many long-range connections, or like small long-range connections to be able to have this this relationship. So basically, it says that you need to look at only your local neighbors to predict if you are a super spreader or not in your spreading processes. Do we have more examples? Yes, so we have. So this one is okay. We generated many graphs of different types, like Erdős-Rényi, small world, SW, or Barabasi-Albert, which is the Corallo graphs, and we compute all the local dimensions of each node, and then we do some statistics like the skewness of the standard deviation of the distributions, and we see that they kind of fall in different regions of the plane. So we can basically use the shape of the distribution of the local dimensions to classify different types of graphs. So we see that they have like a good signature of where they are. And then this was other examples we tried. This one was the world trade of metals. So we have edges between countries if they trade metals in the 90s. And then there is this kind of well-known classification of countries in core countries and semi-peripheral and peripheral countries. And then we see that basically the local dimension is able to statistically differentiate these types of countries just by the graph structure. And we'll go again the C elegans. So this is now undirected C elegans, and we added the muscle neurons, and we see that the different types of neurons have different range of local dimensions basically. So the more central somehow are the interneurons, and then we have the sensory and then motor and muscles lower. So yes, this is kind of correlates with known ground truth, I would say. And this one is the last one. It's a very recent data set that we took from colleagues, where you have drifters on the ocean, and then you have an edge between 2 pixels on the Earth if a drifter goes from 2 to 2 pixels in a given time t, so 16 days here and 200 days. And then we have quite fairly complex graph where you have long range and many different weights, and then you can compute the local dimension for each node, for each pixel, and plot it, and you see that the different scales or different time intervals between drifter collections. You see fairly different types of structure, and they all correlate with like known regions. So you have as Rob showed in the first slide, you have different patches of like circulation currents and so on, and you see that at different scale or different, we still try to analyze this, but we see nice correlations between the centrality measure and the regions where there is strong currents or a complex flow, basically. So yeah, I think I made it in time.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Alexis.
If you want more, we have the papers online. This last one is just a preprint, but the other ones are published.
Yeah, so just to quickly summarize everything. So so we kind of just shown a lot of the work that me and Alexis have done together, kind of under the supervision of Mauricio Barahona. You know, massive feature extraction on graphs. You know, generally just offers better accuracy and interpretation for graph data sets. That, you know, the multi-scale nature of networks extends to the influence of nodes, and not just on kind of like community detection type methods, and that the kind of dimension of networks, or this kind of abstraction of Euclidean dimension onto kind of discrete domains such as networks can help us understand kind of physical processes and differentiate between different node types, for example. Yeah, I mean, there were other people that supported the work as well. I think mostly from Imperial College, but then mostly headed up by Mauricio Barahona. And then the code and links to either the publications or the preprints are available online. So thanks for having us as well. It was a pleasure to be invited.